Should Americans fear Islam?
Christian Amanpour, the host of This Week on ABC News, asked this question to a group of 6 Americans, evenly divided on the issue, during a special report in October 2010. Many of the responses she received, along with public opinion polls, history of racial profiling, and hate crimes across the U.S., show a strong fear of Islam pervading the United States after 9/11. This American fear or anger towards Muslims results from a widespread stereotype generated by Islamist terrorists that all Muslims hate the United States. Peter Gadiel, who lost a son in 9/11, echoes this attitude in his response to Amanpour's question.
Well, I'd like nothing better than to say that I was not afraid of Islam. But the fact is that we have too many history of Muslim terror attacks, and I think to ignore that threat is to ignore the history of Islam.
Dr. Steven Kull, who we heard from briefly last week, is a political psychologist and director of the Program on International Policy Attitudes at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and director of worldpublicopinion.org, an international project studying global public opinion. Kull has tried to quantify Muslim animosity towards the U.S. through his recent book, Feeling Betrayed: The Roots of Muslim Anger at America. The book explores the attitudes of Muslim-majority countries over 5 years through focus groups in Egypt, Morocco, Pakistan, Jordan, Iran, and Indonesia. It also includes in-depth surveys in 11 different countries, adding Palestinian territories, Turkey, Iraq, Bangladesh, and Azerbaijan to the aforementioned 5. His book has been heeded by Emil Nakhleh, former director of the CIA's Political Islam Strategic Analysis Program, and Wendy Chamberlain, president of the Middle East Institute, as an important lesson for policymakers. Kull found that the majority of Muslims abroad do feel negatively towards U.S. foreign policy. He discovered a common feeling of betrayal and oppression from the United States, and explains where this comes from.
The view of the Muslim people on America is heavily conditioned by the perception that the U.S. uses its military force to threaten them, to coerce them, to force them to do things, and they perceive this as being driven by a number of things. One is a desire simply to dominate the region. The desire to dominate the region is seen as heavily linked to oil, but not that being the only reason. And there's also a perception that the U.S. has a hostile attitude toward Islam itself, and that the U.S. is in some way trying to break down Islam, to weaken it, to undermine it, and to ultimately eliminate it.
Kull learned that many citizens in these countries see America as a dominant force that enters the Muslim world to gain something, and through coercion is usually successful. In 2009, when Kull, working with worldpublicopinion.org, asked his samples, "Do you think the United States does or does not use the threat of military force to gain advantages?" 86% in Turkey and Egypt responded it does, with slightly lower percentages for Pakistan, Iraq, Indonesia, and Azerbaijan.
There are things that the U.S. does, the way the U.S. uses military force in the region, that contributes to this perception. Specifically on the question of oil, there is a perception in the Muslim world that the United States has effectively made the statement that the U.S. has a claim on the oil in the region. And the U.S. has never done anything to really clarify that, but that's not what the U.S. is saying.
The feelings of betrayal and oppression do not color the Muslim population's entire view of the United States, however. Kull's work shows that they are upset with U.S. foreign policy, but do not reject the ideas America represents to the world. A strong two-sided tension results within the Muslim population desiring, on the one hand, to be more like the West, and on the other, to not compromise their culture.
There is much about the United States, the West, and the larger world that people in the Muslim world find attractive. They're very much drawn to the ideas of democracy. They're very much drawn to the idea of human rights. These are very large majorities. At the same time, there is a concern that by connecting to the outer world and opening up to these liberal ideas, that this is going to overwhelm their culture and overwhelm their Islamic roots.
Kull says this tension can enable terrorist organizations, as the organizations further promote the feelings of oppression and betrayal by the West, though the majority of Muslims do not agree with the tactics of terrorism.
The United States is seen as such an overpowering force as a culture as well as militarily. And so all these things get kind of work together so that intimidation by the United States makes them feel that they have to root more deeply in their Islamic culture. And this is a narrative that the Al-Qaeda articulates at great length.
Though supportive of the ideas of democracy and human rights, the Muslim population views the United States as inappropriately directing their countries, especially on the topic of government and religion. Kull found a strong fear of the U.S. trying to eradicate Islam. Many took specific statements and phrases from politicians, diplomats, and military officials as representative of American foreign policy. A significant number in his study referenced President Bush's wording of America fighting a crusade against terrorism as a literal crusade against Islam. In the 11 countries he surveyed extensively, Kull found a majority in each that believed the U.S. has a goal of weakening and dividing Islam, with Palestinian territories highest at 93%, Pakistan at 88%, and Egypt and Iran following in similar mindset. The United States' advocacy of secular government, then, is seen by many as a forced system in contradiction with their beliefs and culture. Kull explains these current sentiments in Egypt.
Right now there's a lot of effort and money being directed to promoting democracy in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt. And there are members of Congress who are trying to create provisions that say that none of this money, none of these efforts, none of this training can in any way go toward helping the Muslim Brotherhood.
The Muslim Brotherhood is now considered a major party in Egypt, with the support of many Muslims who are in favor of religious government, including Sharia law, which is in direct conflict with U.S. goals.
Some members of Congress are very distrustful of the Muslim Brotherhood. And for the U.S. to say, well, we're going to help the secular parties, but we're not going to help Islamist parties, is perceived as evidence that the U.S. is hostile to Islam itself. So I think in some way that's undermining the potential for improved relations between the U.S. and Egyptians.
Despite the obstacles facing Western policy and Islamic culture, Kull believes there is potential for enhanced cooperation in the future.
I think with time, there can be greater confidence that the U.S. is not in some way trying to impose on them, or the U.S. is not trying to undermine Islam. The notion that there's a fundamental clash of civilizations and it's impossible for the Islamic world and the West to have any kind of harmonious or cooperative relationship is rejected by a majority of people in the Muslim world.
Kull heard directly from Muslim citizens that they believe this kind of relationship is possible.
In focus groups, they tend to focus on how they perceive the American people, and even the American culture as not being like the American government. So they tend to say, yes, there is a way we can enter into a more harmonious relationship. And for them, the key factor is whether the U.S. can enter into that relationship in a way that doesn't impose on them.
For War News Radio, I'm Elliana Bisgaard-Church.